For each of the graphs of the linear equations shown below, determine if the values for m and b are positive, negative, 0, or undefined for the y equals mx plus b form of the line's equation. Well, this seems a little bit odd because I have these graphs, but notice there's no scale, there's no grid. There really doesn't feel like there's very much information here. And yet we do have enough information to determine about the m and the b value. And remember, we don't have to come up with actual numbers. We just have to decide if they're positive, negative, 0, or undefined. So let's think about what these different values are. When we have y equals mx plus b, remember that the m gives me information about the slope, okay? And that the b gives me information about the y-intercept. That 0b is going to give me the y-intercept. So let's think about what we can tell from this graph. Well, we know that here in the center is the origin. We know these values are going to be positive, and we know these values are going to be negative. And so if I think about, um, let's start by talking about b, about the y-intercept. We see that this line crosses the y-axis down here below the origin. So that means that it would be down here in the negative range. And so that means that my b value is going to have to be negative because it crosses the y-axis below the origin down in the negative value. So my b is going to be negative. Now what about m? Think about going from any one point on this graph to any other point. Say we use these 2 points. Think about how we would move along that graph. We would go up and we would go to the right. So we would go in the positive direction, the positive direction. This line has a positive slope. So my m value would have to be positive. We can also think about that in terms of the line seems to be going uphill as I look at it from left to right, just like when we read. And if the line is increasing in values as we're going from left to right, that means that it's going to have a positive slope. So it's amazing what we can tell with very little information. Let's take a look at this next one and see what we can figure out. We need to know our slope and we need to know our y-intercept. Let's start with the slope this time, our value for m. So m is the slope, and then we're saying, well, does this line have a positive or a negative slope? Two ways to think about it. One way to think about it is to think about any 2 points on the line. And if I'm moving from this point here to this point here, how do I move? Well, I have to go down and then I go to the right. Going down has me going in the negative direction. Going to the right has me going in the positive direction. Negative divided by a positive is going to give me a negative. So the slope is going to be negative in this case. Now, what about the y-intercept? Because remember, that's what the b value is. The b tells me about the y-intercept. And when I look at this line, I can see that it doesn't show where it's going to cross the y-axis. But we do know these are linear equations. We know that they're not all of a sudden going to turn around and start going another direction. They're going to keep going the directions that they're showing. So even though the y-intercept isn't shown, we can anticipate that it's going to cross down here somewhere. Again, below the origin down in the negative values. So in this case, the b value is also negative. Okay, let's see what these last two have for us. This next graph, if we think about the slope, going from this point to this point, how would we get there? Well, we'd still have to go down just a little bit, and then we'd have to go to the right. Again, down is negative, to the right is positive, and so that's telling us that we have a negative slope. Now notice we would get exactly the same answer for that if I started at this point and went back to this point. If I went up, you say, wait a minute, but that's positive. That's true. My rise would be positive in this case, but then I'd have to go to the left to get back to that point. which would be negative. So I still have positive divided by negative is going to give me a negative. Now, what about our b value? Where's our y-intercept? The y-intercept for this guy, and let me just get rid of some of these points so we can see our y-intercept a little bit better. The y-intercept is up here, up above the origin this time. There's where my y-intercept is. And so since that's in the positive range, b must be positive. Last one. Let's do our b value first because I think we're getting pretty good at that by now. We can see here's my origin, here's where the y-intercept is. That's down in the negative range, and so that must mean that my b value is negative because the y-intercept would have to be negative. And then what about the slope? Well, the slope is a little bit tricky here, but there's a couple ways that we can work with it. We can still talk about going from one point to another, but notice that this line doesn't have any slant to it. So when I say, well, how much do I go up or down? What's my rise? Well, I don't have any rise. So my rise for this one would be 0. And what about the run? Well, the run, I don't know what it is, but going from here over to here, I'd be going in the positive direction. And it really wouldn't matter if that was a positive number or a negative number. 0 divided by anything is just going to give me 0. So m has a value. In this case, we can be pretty specific and say that it's 0. You might have worked with horizontal lines enough by now to just have tucked away that anytime you see a horizontal line, it's going to have a slope of 0. Anytime you see a line that has a slope of 0, you know that it's going to be a horizontal line. You might have made that connection already, but if you haven't made that connection, that's fine. Notice that we can still come up with the slope just by thinking about what we know about slope as the rise over the run. When in doubt, just go back to the basic information that you know about a concept, and that will often get you a really long way toward where you need to go.